Hi, welcome to cjreform.info. My name is Jeremy. Today I wanted to talk a little bit about ClickBait and criminal justice reform. Many of you may know, in fact, you may be here right now because you clicked on one of my links in my Twitter feed. I happen to utilize Twitter quite a bit. There's a great community on there of people who are criminal justice reform advocates. There's a lot of activity, the sharing of information, sharing of news articles, etc. So I'm on Twitter quite a bit. I have a pretty good presence on there and enjoy a lot of my interactions with people from across the world, and a large portion of them around this country. Sometimes you'll see an article and you think, oh, that's outrageous. You look at the title, the headline, and it just makes you think, oh my God, this is awful, And then you click on it and you actually read the article and you find it's not quite what the headline had said. Now, I know this topic is not novel. Everyone knows that for years, and probably increasingly so, with all the competition online and the fighting for clicks and people want their stuff seen, that there is something called clickbait, and that is basically like bait, like you're baiting a fish. You're trying to get them to click on your link, and so you'll put something that's a little bit misleading. And what I wanted to talk about today is a few that have come to my attention recently related to criminal justice reform. And I think it's an important issue for a number of reasons, but the main thing is this. People who support criminal justice reform are looked at askance by the rest of people. Everyone else out there who, supports, quote, law and order, as if CJ reform people don't. But people who tend to be pro-prosecution, tend to favor higher sentences. They're perfectly fine with the numbers of incarcerated in this country. They don't see many problems with our criminal justice system. They, perhaps feel bad for those who are wrongfully convicted, but I think deep down they don't really think it happens that often. Those people view us, people like myself who are interested in criminal justice reform, they view us with a lot of skepticism. All the stereotypes come to mind. They label us as, we're anti-victim and, we only support the criminals and, a lot of nonsense, of course. And it goes both ways. We can be unfair to them as well. We can call them a bunch of Trump-loving, I don't know. My point by this is not to get overly political. It doesn't have to be a political thing, but rather simply to say that when supporting and promoting criminal justice reform issues, I think that we are on a higher level. We're called to a higher standard for credibility and for straightforward honesty in presentation of the very real problems that plague our criminal justice system. And so when I come across the use of these clickbait, if you will, misleading articles, news stories, it bothers me because I take this stuff very seriously. I'm hoping to, in a sense, dedicate my profession to this type of work. And so I want there to be a candid, sober discussion online, through social media, through the news, etc., of these issues, and I want those sources to be believable. One such case recently, it was all over Twitter and it was, in the news circuit. The headline read this: Memphis police put GPS monitoring devices on dozens of domestic assault victims. So you may know that if you commit certain types of crimes, it's possible that you will be required to wear a GPS monitoring device, like an ankle bracelet. It is this big computer thing that attaches to your ankle. And this device is used by law enforcement to, in a sense, know where you are. And for example, if you're on house arrest and the police kind of ping your ankle bracelet and see where you're at and it shows that you're at Disneyland, there's a problem, right? And you can be arrested for violating parole, etc. That's how these devices work. So this newspaper article, and this is out of the some source called Raw Story, but I saw it in numerous locations. Again, Memphis police put GPS monitoring devices on dozens of domestic assault victims. Okay, so these are primarily women who have been beaten, by their husbands, by their boyfriends, etc. They're domestic assault victims, and these police, it says, according to this article, put this monitoring device on them. So you get this image of these battered women wearing ankle bracelets, right? And not the pretty decorative kind, but these GPS law enforcement monitored devices. And that immediately strikes you as odd. You're like, well, wait a second. Why are they being labeled? Why do they have to walk around with this, kind of the shame, the stigma, right, of oh, that person's wearing an ankle bracelet. They must be a sex offender or in some way involved with law enforcement. And so, of course, you think this is a problem. And this article gets retweeted and sent across the social media world. And if you don't read the article, if you don't look closely at it, you might think, well, this is a real problem. And those Memphis police are, horrible. Why would they do such a thing? Well, when you actually read the article and look into what's going on here, it turns out that, number one, the Memphis police were not making the women wear these ankle bracelets. They didn't have to wear them. They were given to them. One, the women had a choice. The police offered them and said, hey, would you like to have this in your possession? Because when you have it in your possession, we'll know where you're at. And if we happen to see that your assailant, the person that battered you, is getting close to you or is in your vicinity, we'll warn you. Right? Not so bad. Okay, not such a bad situation. You can imagine a woman, she can keep that ankle bracelet thing in her purse, right? In a day bag, whatever, laying on next to the couch. It doesn't matter. The point is that the headline was misleading. There is a current, a very powerful force that I believe too radically stereotypes the other side. They almost come off as anti-police. You might say they are, anything that smacks of law enforcement, they immediately think they're racist and evil and out to, punish innocent people. And I simply do not believe that. And I stand by this. Here I am as someone who is dedicated to this cause, is involved with this website, cjreform.info. And I'm here to tell you that I believe genuinely that most police officers, most prosecutors are decent people who want to live normal lives and do what we all want, to raise our families, to live happy lives, right? There are, of course, myriads of problems. We all know this. There's misconduct. There are bad apples. There are systemic problems that lead to large amounts of systemic racism and bias and these types of issues. But even that, I want to say, is still a small percentage of those bodies of people. And so, because of that, I feel it's important for us to be honest and to be fair in the way we talk about these news stories. So one other such story that recently was brought to my attention, the headline is this: Georgia toddler denied kidney transplant due to father's criminal record. This is a story where there was this young boy, and he was born prematurely and has serious kidney problems and needs a kidney transplant. It turns out his father is a match and could donate a kidney to him, but his father also happens to be a convicted felon with a criminal record, and very, very recently was just released on parole. He had violated his parole and had weapons charges, etc. Now, the headline, makes it seem pretty clearly that this person cannot donate his kidney to his son. Why? Well, because he's a criminal, right? That's the idea that you get from this headline. And when you look closer, and it's not quite that simple, there is a body of evidence that seems to support the idea that, well, one, when someone is going to be a transplant donor, their recent history is important, maybe even for health, potential infections, things that they were exposed to that could be dangerous to the donee. For example, if you're in a prison or in a jail, not exactly known to be the most sanitary of places. And so that this could be partly why this father was denied, at least at first, the ability to donate the kidney. There's a little bit more to it as well. People want to say, well, this is a racial thing, and had this person been white, this kidney could have been donated. And if you read the comments of these stories, there are people who give stories about how there's people serving prison time and they literally come out, donate an organ, and go right back into prison. And so, it just basically it muddies up the waters a bit, makes it a little bit less clear as to what's going on in this story. It seems that the hospital, Emory University Hospital, had either, depending on what source you go to, they either were postponing his being able to be a donor until they could complete their background check, and that includes a psychological and medical evaluation. And so that this wasn't a firm no, but rather it was a not yet, and we'll wait and see. And if that's the case, you can see how the article is kind of jumping the gun, making it sound like, oh, the hospital denied them, the right for their son to have this kidney. Then there's this other side that you might say, well, okay, the hospital really was. Maybe the hospital, didn't like how this looked. They talk about how they are concerned about the donor just as much as the donee, and that they need to know that this donor can rehabilitate himself in terms of his own physical health, etc., have a recovery. And if he perhaps is going to be going in and out of jail, then perhaps he would not be able to do that. Sounds a little bit altruistic, perhaps, to think of that of Emory University Hospital. And I think in the least, it is good that there was some attention brought to this, whether it was completely straightforward or not, because the hospital has reopened negotiations with the family. They're continuing to talk, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing for these issues to be brought to the forefront. But I feel, as I said earlier, that they need to be done so in a way that is candid, straightforward, and honest. That way, the discussion isn't misleading or murky, such that each side can kind of hold it up as a banner bearer for their position or their particular view of things. I think that it's imperative upon those who are seeking criminal justice reform to maintain accurate evaluations of the reality of our system. And they're so apparent and they're so obvious, on all four corners, that there's no need to use things like clickbait or to use misleading headlines and to take them to places they don't need to go. Because all that's going to do is give the other side fodder, if you will, to say, oh, they're just, a bunch of radicals and, they believe these crazy things, and they'll just easily dismiss the position if we continue to allow these types of news stories to mislead. And again, my point here is not that anyone was intending to mislead anybody, certainly not someone who's, putting this on their Twitter or retweeting this, but rather it falls onto the media, right? The media is the one who is putting these headlines out there. They're the ones who want the ratings because they have the advertisers, etc. So it's just important for us to use these in an appropriate way. One last quick story, if you recall, in Oregon there were some protesters, and they had chained themselves, and the police, in order to remove these chains, had put bags, these sackcloth bags over the protesters' faces as they sawed off these chains. Now, the protesters and many people were saying, well, this is horrible, and look at it, they look like they're terrorists, their faces being covered, they're about to be beheaded or something, and it was in some way like a stigma. Then the other side was like, well, no, we had to use bolt cutters and, these saws to cut through these chains. And in order to protect the safety of the individuals, we put these bags over their heads. Again, it's understandable. You can see where they're coming from. Were there perhaps better ways of doing that? Probably, right? And I think, again, ultimately, that's why it's important for these things to be talked about, and to be brought out to the forefront, because I think the exposure through social media and in the discussions does bring both sides to bear on what actually is the reality of the situation. And so I think that these are just a few examples that can help us hone the ways in which we're using social media to promote our ideas and to continue to, in a healthy, sober way, raise awareness of these causes, which is, in fact, very vital and important. I should note that, as I mentioned in the beginning of this, I use Twitter all the time. I've thought about putting a disclaimer on my Twitter page saying that a retweet does not equal, support of that tweet, in the sense that it's very possible that I will retweet things sometimes that I may or may not completely agree with, but rather I'm wanting to continue the conversation, to continue having a topic brought to the forefront, to be looked at. Because many of these situations are localized. They're taking place, for example, this is in Georgia. These are areas where people who are there can more closely evaluate what's happening because they're on the ground and they can deal with those issues. Whereas those of us who are more removed from those situations can look at it more on a macro level, and look at it for what it's worth in that level. One example of that is I recently posted a blog concerning the prosecutor who apologized to the man that he put away for 40 years wrongfully. And certainly I'll leave a link here. You can go to that blog as well. I had a comment from one of the readers who said that the prosecutor, in fact, was just continuing his, in a sense, sin by using that as an opportunity to get positive publicity, and that he continues to be a very poor prosecutor with questionable standards, and that this show was merely that. It was a kind of in front of the cameras to get some good press and then off with it. That's interesting, right? Because this individual was writing from that location. He knew of that prosecutor from that area. So it's interesting, right? Again, it continues the conversation. I appreciate that deeper dive. And ultimately, it'll be for those in those localized communities to make those decisions as to who they're voting for and how they operate their own particular judicial jurisdictions, etc. But that's why we're here, right? We're here to discuss these things, to talk about them. And my point here today is simply to say, let's keep it all above board, right? Let's make sure that the way we promote these things, hopefully, is in a way that we know that what we're reading is actually a presentation of the reality and not just some clickbait, misleading, incendiary device to fire up one side against the other. Thanks again. I look forward to your comments, your thoughts. Please, again, if you would like to be involved or perhaps to contribute an article to cjreform.info, please email me at jds@cjreform.info. Thanks again.